The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Interstellar Council was the oldest room in known space. It sat at the heart of a station called Apex Orionis, a massive structure that floated between 3 star systems and served as the center of galactic politics. 43 species sent their representatives here. 43 flags hung from the curved ceiling. And today, 43 delegations would vote on the future of humanity. Ambassador Ilara Voss stood at the central podium. She was a tall woman with dark hair pulled back and calm brown eyes that gave nothing away. She had served as humanity's voice on the council for 11 years. She had learned patience in this room. She had learned to read the body language of species that did not have bodies like hers. And right now, reading the room, she already knew how this was going to end. The motion on the floor was called Resolution 7491. Its official title was long and full of careful political language, but its meaning was simple. Humanity was growing too fast. Humanity was spreading too far. Humanity needed to be controlled. High Legislator Quavreth of the Velthari hegemony had introduced the resolution 3 months ago. He was an insectoid creature, tall and thin, with a hard shell of deep green and eyes like polished black stones. The Velthari were one of the oldest species in the council. They had been building empires when humans were still living in caves. And Quavreth did not like what he saw when he looked at humanity's trajectory. He stood now at his delegation's platform, his voice clicking and buzzing through the universal translator. Humanity has colonized 38 star systems in 200 years, he said. No species in recorded history has expanded at this rate. Their population doubles every 90 years. Their terraforming technology reshapes entire worlds. Their trade networks have reached into every corner of council space. He paused and let his black eyes sweep the chamber. This is not growth. This is a flood. And if we do not build walls now, we will drown. There was murmuring across the chamber. Many delegations nodded. The Dranathi Collective, an aquatic hive mind species that occupied 12 water worlds, signaled their agreement through a pulsing blue light on their communication orb. They had co-sponsored the resolution. They had their own reasons to fear humanity. Human researchers had been making breakthroughs in biotech that the Dranathi had been working on for centuries. It was embarrassing. It was threatening. She listened to the Veltari talk about destabilizing influence. She listened to the Dranathi representative describe humanity's dangerous flexibility. She listened to a dozen other species express their concerns, some genuine and some clearly just following the political winds. And then it was her turn to speak. She stepped forward and placed her hands flat on the podium. She did not raise her voice. She did not make grand gestures. She spoke the way she always spoke, like someone sharing a simple truth over a cup of coffee. Humanity has colonized 38 systems, she said. That is true. But I would like the Council to consider something. 31 of those worlds were classified as uninhabitable by Council surveys. Worlds too hot, too cold, too dry, too toxic. No one wanted them. We took them and we made them into homes. She let that sit for a moment. We shared our terraforming data openly. Any species could use it. We shared medical research that helped cure the Olari plague of 2894. We did not charge for it. We opened free navigation corridors through our space so that 17 species could trade more efficiently. We did not ask for anything in return. She looked at Kovreth. We were told the galaxy was a community. We acted like it was, and now we are told that our contribution is a threat. The chamber was quiet. The Olari ambassador, a small creature covered in soft golden fur with wide, gentle eyes, looked down at his hands. He had voted against the resolution in committee. He would vote against it again today, but he knew it would not matter. Kovreth responded smoothly. No one questions humanity's contributions, but contributions do not erase risk. A river that feeds your crops can also flood your home. We must manage the river before it is too late. The debate continued for another 2 hours, but it was really already over. The votes had been counted in back rooms and private meetings long before today. The Veltari had built their coalition carefully. They had promised favors, made threats, and played on the quiet fear that almost every older species felt when they looked at humanity. Because the truth that no one wanted to say out loud was simple. Humans were not dangerous because they were aggressive. Humans were dangerous because they were good at everything. They adapted too quickly. They learned too fast. They cooperated too easily with other species. They were too flexible, too creative, too willing to go where others would not go and do what others could not do. And that terrified the species who had spent thousands of years believing they were the best the galaxy had to offer. The vote was called. The chamber fell silent as each delegation registered their decision. The numbers appeared on the central display, one by one. Green for yes, red for no. The final count was 31-12. Resolution 7491 passed. Quavreth allowed himself a small motion of satisfaction, a slight raising of his upper limbs that was the Velthari equivalent of a nod. He turned his black eyes to Voss, waiting. He expected anger. He expected a speech about injustice. He expected threats about consequences. He had prepared responses for all of these. Voss looked at the numbers on the display. She looked at them for a long time. Then she gathered her documents from the podium, placed them neatly in her case, and closed it with a soft click. "The Council's decision is noted," she said. Her voice was steady and calm, and completely empty of emotion. "Humanity will comply." And then she walked out. She did not slam the door. She did not look back. She simply walked through the great arched entrance of the Grand Chamber and disappeared into the corridor beyond. He had prepared for anger, and he had prepared for threats. He had not prepared for this. The silence she left behind filled the chamber like cold water filling a glass. It pressed against the walls. It settled into the seats. It was heavy and strange and deeply, deeply uncomfortable. The Olari ambassador leaned toward his aide. His golden fur was standing on end, which meant he was afraid. "What have we done?" he whispered. His aide had no answer. Several other minor species ambassadors exchanged glances across the chamber. Something had just happened that they did not fully understand yet. Something important. Something that could not be undone. Quavreth felt it too, a flicker of doubt, cold and quick, like a crack in ice. He pushed it down. He told himself this was the right decision. He told himself the Council was strong enough to stand on its own. He told himself that humanity would protest, negotiate, and eventually accept their reduced role. That was how politics worked. That was how it had always worked. But Voss had not protested. Voss had not negotiated. Voss had said, "We will comply," and walked out with the calm of someone who already knew exactly what was going to happen next. And for the first time in his very long career, High Legislator Quavreth wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. The first sign came 30 days after the vote. A formal notice, printed on clean white digital paper with the seal of the United Human Systems at the top, arrived at every council embassy, trade office, and navigation authority in the galaxy. It was polite. It was professional. It was devastating. In accordance with the terms of Resolution 7491, and in respect of the Council's authority over human activities in Council-regulated space, the United Human Systems hereby provides 90 days' notice of the closure of all free navigation corridors through human-administered territory. 17 species use those corridors. For some of them, the corridors cut weeks off their most important trade routes. For others, the corridors were the only safe path between their homeworld and their colonies. Humans had opened them as a gift decades ago and maintained them at their own expense. They had never charged a single credit for passage. Now, with 90 days' notice and every piece of paperwork filed correctly, the corridors were closing. The Council's Trade Commission held an emergency meeting. Representatives argued and shouted. The Drenathi delegate demanded that the corridors be declared shared galactic infrastructure and kept open by law. But the legal experts shook their heads. The corridors ran through human space. Humans had built the relay stations, the fuel depots, the communication arrays. They had every right to close them. And they were doing it politely. That was the part that made it so hard to fight. Over the next 18 months, humanity pulled back from Council space with the quiet efficiency of a surgeon removing stitches. Every withdrawal was legal. Every closure came with proper notice. Every departure was accompanied by a polite letter of thanks. On the Ulari homeworld, a small green planet with soft hills and wide rivers, a human medical mission had been operating for 40 years. When the Ulari plague had swept through their population in 2894, it was human doctors who had found the cure. The mission had stayed on afterward, training local physicians, running clinics in rural areas, and treating diseases that Ulari medicine still struggled with. 300,000 Ulari owed their lives to that mission. The mission began packing on day 60. Equipment was carefully boxed. Patient records were transferred to local hospitals. The human doctors held final training sessions and wrote detailed guides for every treatment protocol they had developed. On the last day, the mission director, a gray-haired woman named Dr. Sato, stood at the door of the main clinic and shook hands with every Ulari staff member. Many of them were crying. Sato's eyes were red, but she held herself together. "You are ready," she told them. "You know everything we know. You will be fine." But everyone knew that was not entirely true. The Ulari were good doctors, but they did not have human instincts. They did not have that strange human ability to look at a set of symptoms and make a leap of logic that no textbook could teach. The clinic would survive, but it would not be the same. On 3 Drenathi colony worlds, terraforming projects were in mid-process when the human consultants received their recall orders. The atmospheric processors were only 60% installed. The soil enrichment programs were halfway through their cycles. The Drenathi engineers who had been working alongside the humans suddenly found themselves holding tools they did not fully understand, staring at systems they had never been trained to maintain alone. The humans had always been there to handle the complicated parts. It had been easy to let them. The lead Drenathi engineer on one of these worlds sent a message to the collective's central authority. "The humans left us detailed instructions," she reported. "But the instructions assume a level of technical understanding that we do not currently possess. We estimate a 2-year delay in terraforming completion, at minimum." The collective's response was cold and brief. Adapt. Human merchants were the next to go. They did not need to declare an embargo. Resolution 7491 imposed new tariffs, inspections, and licensing requirements on human trade in Council space. The regulations were designed to slow human economic influence. They succeeded, but they succeeded in the same way that cutting off your own hand succeeds in preventing a handshake. Human merchants simply redirected their goods to the Outer Rim Cooperative, a loose network of minor species and independent worlds that existed outside Council jurisdiction. The prices were fair. The routes were open. The paperwork was simple. Within 6 months, the Outer Rim markets were booming, and Council markets were feeling the gap. The effects spread like cracks in glass. A Velthari colony on the edge of their territory had been receiving human grain shipments for 30 years. The colony sat on a resource-rich world with valuable minerals, but its soil was poor, and it could not grow enough food for its population. Human freighters had been delivering surplus grain at below-market prices as part of a long-standing trade agreement. When the shipments stopped, the colony's food reserves lasted 4 months. After that, rationing began. The colony's governor sent a desperate message to the Velthari hegemony. Quavreth read it in his office on Apex Orionis. The governor begged for emergency food supplies. Quavreth forwarded the request to the hegemony's logistics division. The logistics division responded that rerouting supplies would take 3 to 4 months, because their transport network was not designed for this kind of rapid redistribution. It had never needed to be. The humans had handled it. Quavreth sat in his office for a long time after reading that report. He looked out the window at the stars and told himself that this was a temporary adjustment. The hegemony would adapt. They would build new supply lines. They would become self-sufficient again, as they had been before humans arrived. But a small voice in the back of his mind, the voice he kept trying to silence, whispered something uncomfortable. The hegemony had not been self-sufficient before humans arrived. The hegemony had been in a slow decline for centuries. Their economy had been stagnating. Their colonies had been struggling. And then humans had come along and started fixing things. Not because anyone asked them to. Not because they wanted power or influence, but because humans saw a problem, and their first instinct was to solve it. The humans had been carrying the hegemony on their backs for decades, and no one had noticed because they had never complained about the weight. Meanwhile, on Apex Orionis itself, the changes were subtle but visible. The human quarter of the station, once a lively district full of restaurants, shops, and cultural centers, was going quiet. Storefronts closed one by one. The little coffee shop on level 7, where diplomats from 20 species used to gather for informal talks, shut its doors. The human library, which had the largest collection of translated alien literature in the galaxy, packed its books into crates and shipped them home. Counselor Amaria of the Olari watched all of this with growing horror. She had voted against Resolution 7491. She had argued against it in committee, in private meetings, in every forum she could find. Now she spent her evenings compiling a report, a detailed accounting of every service, every trade route, every medical program, every piece of infrastructure that humanity was withdrawing. The list grew longer every week. She sent copies to every council member. Most of them did not read it. A few read it and dismissed it. Short-term disruptions, they said. The market will adjust. We managed before humans. We will manage again. Amaria wanted to scream at them. She wanted to drag them to the empty clinics on her homeworld, to the half-finished terraforming sites on Drenethi colonies, to the hungry families on Velthari border worlds. But she was a small ambassador from a small species, and in the grand politics of the council, her voice had never carried far. The 18th month after the vote arrived. The GIC Logistics Division published its quarterly report. Trade efficiency across council space had dropped by 14%. Famine warnings had been issued for 2 Veltari colonies and 1 Drenathi outpost. Piracy in the forward corridor zones had increased by 300%, and 12 minor species had formally requested reviews of their council membership. The report landed on Kuvret's desk. He read it alone. When he finished, he sat very still. His aide entered and asked if everything was satisfactory. Kuvret straightened himself and clicked his mandibles. "We survived before the humans," he said. "We will survive without them." His aide nodded and left, but in the corridor outside, she paused and looked back at the closed door. She had served Kuvret for 20 years. She knew when he was certain and when he was trying to convince himself. And for the first time in those 20 years, she could not tell the difference. 3 years after the vote, the galaxy looked different. Not destroyed, not burning, nothing so dramatic. It was more like a house where someone had quietly removed the foundation, one brick at a time, until the walls started to lean and the doors stopped closing properly. Everything still stood, but nothing worked the way it used to. The Velthari hegemony's outer colonies were the first to truly break. 2 of them, mining worlds on the edge of Velthari space, had been teetering on the edge of crisis for months. When their emergency food reserves finally ran out, the governors did something that had not happened in Velthari history for over 1,000 years. They sent open distress signals. Not private requests through government channels. Open signals, broadcast on every frequency, begging anyone who could hear for help. The hegemony was humiliated. Clovreth ordered the signals jammed, but it was too late. Half the galaxy had already heard them. News networks across Council space ran the story for weeks. The mighty Velthari, the oldest and proudest civilization in the Council, could not feed their own people. Clovreth organized emergency supply convoys, but the logistics were a nightmare. The hegemony's internal transport network had been designed 1,000 years ago and had never been properly modernized. Why would it have been? For the last 50 years, human freighters had handled most of the heavy cargo work in the region. They had been fast, reliable, and cheap. Now the Velthari were trying to do it themselves, with ships that were slower, fewer, and not built for bulk transport. Supplies that should have taken days to deliver took weeks. On one of the struggling colonies, a young Velthari worker, named Thivan, stood in a ration line that stretched around the block. She remembered the human freighters that used to land at the spaceport every week. Big ugly ships painted in bright colors, with human crews who smiled and waved and handed out candy to the children. She remembered her mother saying that humans were strange but kind. She remembered the day the freighters stopped coming. No one had explained why. The adults had just looked angry and confused. Now Thivan was 20 years old and hungry, and she had heard the stories about how the Council had voted to push humans away. She did not understand the politics of it. She just knew that when the humans were here, there was food, and now that they were gone, there was not. The Drenathai Collective faced a different kind of crisis, but it was just as painful. The Drenathai were proud of their scientific achievements. Their biotech programs were among the best in the galaxy, but the truth was that many of their biggest breakthroughs in the last century had come from joint research with human scientists. Humans brought a different way of thinking. They made connections that Drenathi researchers missed. They asked questions that seemed stupid at first, and then turned out to be brilliant. Under Resolution 7491, human researchers had been expelled from Drenathi universities and laboratories. The official reason was security concerns. The real reason was pride. The Drenathi leadership could not stand the fact that their best work was being done in partnership with a species that had only been in space for 200 years. Now the consequences were becoming clear. A major research program on Drenathi neural decay, a disease that affected 1 in every 50 Drenathi and slowly destroyed their ability to think, had been co-developed with a human neuroscientist named Dr. James Okafor. Dr. Okafor had spent 15 years on the project. He had been close to a breakthrough. When his expulsion order came, he had tried to hand off his work to his Drenathi colleagues. He had spent his last 3 weeks writing detailed notes, recording explanations, and training his replacement. But some things could not be transferred in 3 weeks. Dr. Okafor's research involved a way of thinking about neural networks that was uniquely human. It was based on patterns he had observed in human brain development and applied to Drenathi biology. His Drenathi replacement was a brilliant scientist, but she could not follow his logic. It was like trying to read music when you had never heard a song. The notes were there, but the melody was missing. 3 years later, the Neural Decay project was stalled. No new progress had been made. The Drenathai Health Authority quietly estimated that 40,000 Drenathai would develop the disease in the next decade, who might have been saved if the research had continued on schedule. No one said Dr. Okafor's name in official meetings, but everyone thought it. Beyond the economic and scientific problems, there was the matter of security. The former free navigation corridors, once the safest trade routes in the galaxy, had become hunting grounds for pirates. Without human patrol ships keeping order, raiders moved in within months. They were organized, well-armed, and bold. Council merchant convoys were attacked regularly. Insurance rates for cargo ships tripled. Some trade routes were abandoned entirely because no company would risk sending ships through them. The Council's Joint Defense Fleet was supposed to handle this, but the fleet had always been more of a symbolic force than a real military. It looked impressive in parades, but its command structure was tangled, with each species insisting on their own protocols and procedures. Human tactical officers had once served as informal coordinators, smoothing over the differences and making the fleet actually function. Without them, joint operations were slow, confused, and often failed. The Drenathi learned this the hard way when they sent a flotilla to clear pirates from a key trade junction. The operation should have been simple, but the Drenathi commanders could not coordinate effectively with their Velthari support ships. Communications broke down. The fleet arrived at the junction in pieces instead of as a unified force. The pirates, who were better organized, ambushed the leading ships and destroyed 3 of them before the rest retreated. It was the worst military loss the Drenathi had suffered in 500 years. In the middle of all this chaos, a small species called the Kithari made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the Council. The Kithari were a reptilian people from a single-system civilization. They were not powerful. They were not wealthy. They had joined the Council 200 years ago for protection and trade access. And now their ambassadors stood before the Grand Chamber and announced that the Kithari were leaving. Her resignation speech was short and devastating. "We joined this council for protection and prosperity," she said. "Humanity offered both, freely and without conditions. You drove them away. We have watched this council stumble and fail for 3 years. We have watched our trade routes collapse, our ships attacked, our economy shrink, and we have watched the Outer Rim Cooperative grow and thrive under human partnership." She paused. "We will go where the future is. We wish the council well." She walked out. It was a smaller exit than Voss's had been, from a smaller podium, by a smaller species, but it hit just as hard. Within months, 4 more minor species followed the Kithari, then 3 more. The council was bleeding members, and each departure made the remaining members weaker, which made departure more tempting for the next species considering it. Counselor Amaria of the Olari watched it all with a mixture of grief and grim validation. Her dossier, the one she had been compiling since the beginning, was now 300 pages long. She had documented everything. Every closed clinic, every failed supply line, every stalled research project, every pirate attack, every departing species. She had sent it to every council member, every news outlet, every academic institution that would listen. This time, people read it. The evidence was everywhere, in empty shelves and delayed ships and desperate distress signals. Amaria's report simply put numbers to what everyone could already feel. And then came the intelligence report. A council spy network, one of the few that still functioned well, had been monitoring human space. Their findings were classified as top secret. They were also leaked within a week. Humanity was not just surviving outside the council. Humanity was thriving. Freed from council regulations and restrictions, they had colonized 12 new systems in 3 years. Their economy was growing at twice its previous rate. The Outer Rim Cooperative was booming, with human goods, medicine, and technology flowing to dozens of species who had never had access to such things before. Human universities were accepting students from every cooperative species. Human hospitals were treating patients from worlds the Council had never even contacted. Quavreth read the intelligence report in his private chambers. He read it twice. Then he turned on the Galactic News Network and saw a broadcast from a new hospital on a Kithari colony world. Ambassador Alara Voss was there for the opening ceremony. She was older now, with more gray in her hair, but she was smiling. It was a real smile, warm and easy, the kind of smile Quavreth had never seen on her face during her years on Apex Orionis. She looked happy. She looked free. Quavreth turned off the screen and sat in the dark for a very long time. The truth he had been avoiding for 3 years finally caught up with him. And it was worse than he had imagined. He had not weakened humanity by pushing them out. He had not protected the Council by restricting them. He had done something far more foolish than that. And in doing so, he had shown the entire galaxy that the Council needed humanity far more than humanity had ever needed the Council. 5 years after the vote, the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Interstellar Council felt too big. Not because the room had changed, but because so many seats were now empty. 8 species had left. Their flags still hung from the ceiling because no one had the heart to take them down. But the platforms below them were dark and quiet. The chamber that had once buzzed with the voices of 43 civilizations now held only 35. And even among those, the mood was not what it used to be. Councillor Amaria of the Ulari stood at the central podium. She was not a tall creature. The Ulari were small and soft, covered in golden fur, with round eyes that made them look perpetually gentle. Other species often underestimated them. That had always been a mistake. Amaria had spent 5 years building this moment. 5 years of compiling data, writing reports, making arguments, and being ignored. 5 years of watching her homeworld's clinics struggle without human doctors. 5 years of attending emergency sessions about food shortages and pirate attacks and economic decline. She was tired, but today she was also ready. "I introduce Resolution 8012, she said. Her voice was small, but it carried through every corner of the silent chamber. The full repeal of Resolution 7491, a formal apology to the United Human Systems, and an official invitation for humanity to rejoin the Galactic Interstellar Council under terms of full equality and reparative consideration." The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted, some in support, some in outrage. The Dranathi communication orb pulsed rapidly between blue and white, which meant their collective was divided. Several minor species ambassadors stood and applauded. And at the Velthari platform, High Legislator Quavreth sat very, very still. The debate lasted 2 days. Amaria presented her case with 5 years of evidence. She showed the trade numbers. She showed the famine reports. She showed the casualty figures from pirate attacks. She showed the list of species that had left the Council and the projections for how many more would follow. She showed the intelligence reports about humanity's booming Outer Rim cooperative. She was thorough and calm and utterly devastating. Other delegates spoke in support. The ambassador from the Fen Republic, a species of quiet, thoughtful beings who had said little during the original vote, gave a speech that would be remembered for generations. "We told ourselves that we were managing a risk," he said, "but the truth is simpler and more shameful than that. We were jealous, we were afraid, and we punished the one species that had done nothing but help us." On the second day, Quavreth rose to speak. The chamber fell silent. Everyone wanted to hear what he would say. He was the architect of Resolution 7491. He was the one who had pushed humanity out. And now, standing on his platform with his green shell dull and his movements slower than they used to be, he looked like a creature carrying a very heavy weight. He did not apologize. He could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he argued against Resolution 8012. Not because he believed he had been right, though he tried to pretend he did, but because admitting he had been wrong would mean accepting that everything that had happened in the last 5 years was his fault. The famine, the piracy, the economic collapse, the departing species, the 40,000 Dranathi who would develop neural decay because a human scientist had been forced to leave his work unfinished. All of it, his fault. So he gave a speech about pride and self-reliance. He talked about the dignity of the elder races. He talked about the importance of solving problems without depending on others. His words were polished, and his delivery was strong. But the speech was hollow, and everyone in the chamber knew it. Even Quovreth knew it. He could see it in the eyes of the other delegates. Not anger, something worse. Pity. The vote was called. Resolution 8012 passed 29-7. Quovreth voted against it. It did not matter. A formal delegation was assembled within a week. 12 ambassadors from 12 species, led by Amaria herself, boarded a diplomatic vessel and set course for Nova Geneva, humanity's new capital world. The journey took 3 weeks because they could no longer use the old corridors. They had to go the long way around. When they arrived, they were not prepared for what they saw. Nova Geneva had been a barren rock 5 years ago, a gray, lifeless world with thin atmosphere and no water. Council surveys had classified it as uninhabitable. Humans had looked at it and seen a home. The delegation's ship descended through clouds, real clouds, and below them spread a world of green forests, blue lakes, and white cities that seemed to grow out of the landscape rather than sit on top of it. The architecture was beautiful, but not showy. It was designed to blend with nature, to work with the planet rather than against it. Solar collectors shaped like flowers turned to follow the sun. Wind turbines stood on hilltops like silver trees. Rivers ran clean through city centers where people walked on bridges lined with growing plants. And it was not just humans. The delegation could see Kithari neighborhoods with their distinctive red stone buildings. Olari expatriates had built a district that looked like a small piece of their homeworld, with rounded houses and garden rooftops. There were species the delegation did not even recognize, peoples from distant worlds who had found their way to the cooperative and been welcomed. Amaria pressed her small hand against the window of the ship and stared. This was what the council could have been. This was what the galaxy could have looked like if they had not been so afraid. Ambassador Elara Voss met them at the landing platform. She was older now, with silver running through her dark hair, but her eyes were the same, calm and brown and giving nothing away. She wore a simple gray suit with the emblem of the Outer Rim Cooperative on her collar. Her title was now Secretary General, a position she had been elected to by the cooperative's member species. Humans had not chosen her. Everyone had. She greeted each delegate personally. She shook hands with some and performed the traditional greetings of others. She knew all the customs. When she reached Amaria, she knelt down to the Ulari's height and smiled. "Counselor Amaria," she said, "it is good to see you." Amaria's fur rippled, which meant she was trying not to cry. "It is good to see you too, Secretary General." Voss led them to a meeting room in the cooperative's headquarters. It was a bright, airy space, with windows that looked out over a forest. She served them tea. Actual tea, brewed from plants grown on Nova Geneva soil. She asked about old colleagues. She asked about the station. She asked how the Ulari were doing. She was warm and genuine, and not a single word she spoke contained any bitterness. Then the delegation presented Resolution 8012, the formal apology, the invitation to return, the reparative terms. Voss read the document carefully. She took her time. The room was quiet except for the sound of birds outside the window. When she finished, she set the document down and looked at the delegation for a long moment. "We are honored by the Council's reconsideration," she said. "This must have taken great courage, and we respect that. We will bring this to our people." The delegation waited. Days turned into weeks. They were given comfortable quarters on Nova Geneva and invited to tour the planet. They saw schools where human children sat next to Kithari and Olari children, learning together. They saw hospitals that treated patients from 30 different species. They saw research labs where scientists from a dozen worlds worked side by side on problems that mattered. They saw the future, and it was already happening without the Council. After 6 weeks, the answer came. It did not come from Voss. It came from a public referendum held across all human worlds and cooperative member states. Every voice counted. The answer was no. The official response was delivered to the delegation in a sealed document. It was written with care and respect. It thanked the Council for its gesture. It expressed hope for future cooperation on specific issues like trade, scientific exchange, and security coordination. It praised the courage of those who had pushed for reconciliation. And then it said simply and clearly that humanity had found its path, and the cooperative had become a home for many species who believed in a different kind of galactic community. They wished the Council well. Amaria read the response in her quarters that evening. She read it 3 times. Then she set it down and let herself cry. Not because she was angry. She understood. She understood perfectly. If she had been in their position, she might have said the same thing. But understanding did not make it hurt any less. Voss came to see them off. She embraced Amaria and whispered something to her that the Olari would not share with anyone for many years. The ship lifted off. Through the windows, the delegates watched Nova Geneva shrink below them. The green forests, the blue lakes, the white cities, the life that humanity had built from nothing on a world no one else had wanted. It grew smaller and smaller until it was just a point of light among the stars. The journey back to Apex Orionis was silent. Kovreth was waiting in his quarters when the news arrived. His aide delivered it in person. The old Velthari listened without speaking. When his aide finished, there was a long silence. "Is there anything you need, High Legislator?" his aide asked. Kovreth was still for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and broken in a way his aide had never heard before. "I need them to come back," he said. His aide stood in the doorway and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The humans were not coming back, and the reason they were not coming back was standing right in front of her, old and diminished, and finally, far too late, beginning to understand the size of what he had lost. 20 years had passed since the vote. The galaxy had changed in ways that no one in that grand chamber could have predicted, though perhaps they should have. The signs had been there from the beginning, written in the calm face of a woman who gathered her papers and walked out without looking back. The Galactic Interstellar Council still existed. It met in the same chamber on Apex Orionis, under the same curved ceiling with its hanging flags. But 19 of those flags now hung above empty platforms. The chamber was less than half full. The voices that filled it were quieter, less certain, and haunted by the echo of what the room used to sound like when it was whole. The council governed a shrinking territory. Its trade networks were functional but diminished. Its military fleet was adequate but no longer impressive. Its scientific output was respectable but no longer leading. The golden age of the council, the age when it had been the undisputed center of galactic civilization, was clearly over. Everyone knew it. No one liked to say it out loud. The Outer Rim Cooperative, which people now simply called the Cooperative, had grown into something remarkable. What had started as a loose network of minor species and human colonies was now the largest interstellar organization in the galaxy. Over 60 species were members. It had its own parliament, its own courts, its own trade agreements, and its own fleet. Its capital was Nova Geneva, the garden world that humans had built from bare rock, and its influence stretched across hundreds of star systems. But the most remarkable thing about the cooperative was not its size or its power. It was its structure. When humanity had founded it, they had made a choice that surprised everyone. They did not put themselves at the top. They did not claim leadership or special status. Instead, they insisted on a rotating council, equal representation for every member species regardless of size or wealth, and a constitution that guaranteed the rights of every citizen, human or otherwise. The Velthari had once accused humans of wanting to dominate the galaxy. The cooperative was humanity's answer. They had built the institution that the Council had always claimed to be, but never actually was. A true community of equals, where a small reptilian species like the Cathari had the same vote as the humans who had founded it. High Legislator Quavreth did not live to see the cooperative reach its full maturity. He died 15 years after the vote, on Apex Orionis, in the same quarters where he had read the intelligence reports and sat in the dark. In his final years, he had stepped down from active politics and spent his time writing. His memoir, published a year before his death, became one of the most widely read books in Velthari history. The book was honest in a way that Quavreth had never been during his political career. He wrote about ambition and fear and pride. He wrote about the way power can make you believe that you are always right, simply because no one dares to tell you that you are wrong. He wrote about the moment when Voss walked out of the chamber, and the silence that followed. The final chapter was called The Weight of a Quiet Room. In it he described that moment in detail. He wrote about how he had prepared for anger, for threats, for negotiation. He had prepared for everything except what actually happened. He wrote that he had commanded fleets and shaped policy for over a century, but that he had never been as frightened as he was in that silence. And he finally understood what the silence was. It was the sound of someone who did not need you, realizing that you had just given them permission to leave. The memoir did not ask for forgiveness. Quavreth was too proud for that, even at the end. But it asked for understanding, and in its painful honesty, it found something close to grace. Velthari schools made it required reading. Young Velthari who had grown up hearing about Resolution 7491 could finally understand, through the words of the creature who had authored it, exactly how and why it had happened. 7 years after Quavreth's death, the Velthari hegemony applied for membership in the cooperative. It was a moment that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The proudest, oldest civilization in the galaxy, the same civilization that had led the effort to restrict humanity, now stood before the cooperative's parliament and asked to join as a standard member, not as a senior partner, as an equal, the same as every other species. The application was accepted. The Velthari flag was raised alongside 60 others on Nova Geneva. The ceremony was simple and dignified. No one gloated, no one brought up the past. A human diplomat shook hands with the Velthari representative and said, "Welcome home." The Velthari representative, who was Quavreth's former aide, the same woman who had stood in his doorway on the night he said he needed them to come back, had to look away so that no one would see the emotion in her eyes. The Dranathi Collective joined 10 years after that. Their application included a quiet footnote requesting the cooperative's assistance in resuming the neural decay research project that had been abandoned decades ago. A human neuroscientist, a former student of Dr. James Okafor, was assigned to the project within a month. Councillor Amaria of the Olari had remained on the council through all of this. She had stayed, not because she believed the council could be saved, but because she believed someone needed to keep the bridge open. She had spent 20 years being that bridge, arguing for cooperation with the cooperative, pushing for joint programs and shared research, trying to prevent the gap between the two institutions from becoming permanent. In the 20th year, she received a message from Nova Geneva. The cooperative wished to award her the Order of Bridging, their highest honor for individuals who work to connect species across divides. She was the first non-cooperative citizen to receive it. She traveled to Nova Geneva for the ceremony. She was old now. Her golden fur had gone white around her face, and her movements were slow. But her eyes were still sharp and bright. She stood at the podium in the cooperative's parliament building, a beautiful structure made of wood and glass that let sunlight pour in from every direction, and she looked out at the assembled representatives of 60 species. She saw Kithari, and Velthari, and Drenathai, and dozens of others, all sitting together, all equal, all part of something that worked. She gave a short speech. Her voice was thin with age, but steady. "I did not save the council," she said. "I could not. But perhaps by trying, I helped build the bridge that others could cross. That is enough for me." The Parliament gave her a standing ovation. She stood at the podium with tears running down her fur and let the sound wash over her. Somewhere in the crowd, Ilara Voss, now retired from public office, but still living on Nova Geneva, stood and clapped with the rest. Their eyes met across the room, and Voss nodded. It was the same calm nod she had given in the Grand Chamber 20 years ago, but this time it carried something different. Not resignation, gratitude. The story might have ended there, but stories about civilizations do not end neatly. They continue in the lives of the people who inherit them. On Nova Geneva, in the heart of the capital city, there was a museum. It was called the Museum of Interstellar Relations, and it was dedicated to the history of contact between species. One of its most popular exhibits was a holographic recreation of the Grand Chamber on Apex Orionis, set on the day of the vote on Resolution 7491. Visitors could walk through the ghostly chamber and watch the debate unfold. They could see the delegates argue. They could see the vote tallied. And they could watch the holographic image of Ambassador Voss gather her papers, nod, and walk out. On a quiet afternoon, 20 years and 3 months after the vote, a young Velthari student stood in front of this exhibit. She was barely an adult by Velthari standards, with a bright green shell and curious dark eyes that reminded some of the museum staff of old photographs of Quavreth as a young legislator. She had read his memoir in school. She had studied the history of Resolution 7491. She knew the facts. But standing here, watching the hologram, she felt something that facts alone could not provide. She watched the ghostly Voss walk toward the chamber doors. The hologram was detailed enough to show the slight tension in her jaw, the steadiness of her hands, the absolute control in every step. The Velthari student watched her reach the doors and pass through them, fading into light. She was older, with gray hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She wore a museum guide badge. She had been watching the student for a while, and now she stepped closer. "Do you have any questions?" she asked. The student was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to the guide with an expression that was difficult to read, something between curiosity and guilt and genuine desire to understand. "Were you angry?" she asked. "Your species, when it happened, were you angry at us?" The guide considered this. She did not answer right away. She looked at the holographic chamber, now resetting to play the scene again, and she thought carefully about what to say. "Some were," she said. "For a while, it hurt. We had given a lot, and being told we were a threat for giving it, that was hard to hear." She paused. "But mostly we were sad. We had wanted it to work. We wanted to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We wanted to belong." She smiled then, a gentle, honest smile that held no bitterness. "And when you told us we could not, well, we did what humans have always done." The student tilted her head. "What is that?" The guide looked at her with warm eyes. "We built something new, and we left the door open." The student turned back to the exhibit. The hologram played again. The ghostly Voss gathered her papers, nodded, and walked through the chamber doors. She disappeared into the light, just as she had 20 years ago. But this time, the student noticed something she had not seen before. The doors of the chamber remained open after Voss passed through them. The hologram held on that image for a long moment. The great arched doors of the grand chamber, standing open, with light pouring through from the other side. The student looked from the hologram to the real doors of the museum. They were open too. Beyond them, The bright sky of Nova Geneva stretched wide and endless, filled with the glittering trails of ships arriving from 100 different worlds, coming and going, all of them welcome. She stood there for a long time, the young Velthari, looking through those open doors at the sky full of ships, and she understood something that her ancestors had not. The door had always been open. It had never been closed, not by humanity, not even after everything that had happened. The humans had built something extraordinary out of rejection, and they had done it without walls, without gates, and without the kind of fear that had driven the council to push them away. The door was open. It had always been open. All anyone ever had to do was walk through it.